The Arizona sun had a way of burning everything it touched, earth, bone, and memory alike. By late afternoon, the heat shimmered above the dry plains, twisting the air like smoke. From the distance, Clara Dawson's cabin stood alone against a backdrop of red rock cliffs, its weathered boards silvered by years of dust storms and desert wind. The land was wild, hard, and lonely. So was she. Clara had lived on this patch of earth for 6 years, ever since the fire. People in town still whispered about that night. How her husband's ranch had gone up in flames, how she was dragged out half dead. Her face and shoulder burned raw. They said it was an accident, but Clara knew better. Greedy neighbors had wanted the Dawson land, and one careless spark was all it took to turn her world to ash. When she recovered, the mirror became her enemy. The left side of her face bore the marks of that fire, uneven skin, pale and ridged, cutting across her cheek and jaw. The doctor said she was lucky to live. But luck was a cruel kind of mercy when it left you disfigured. Men who once tipped their hats now looked away. Women spoke kindly but with pity softening their eyes. The only ones who didn't flinch were children, and even they sometimes stared too long. So Clara stopped looking at people. She stopped going into town except when she absolutely had to. The fire had taken her family, her beauty, and her place in the world. But it hadn't taken her will. That stubborn spark inside her refused to die. Each dawn she woke before the light, stoked the embers in the hearth, and worked until the sun fell again. She had rebuilt part of the barn herself, chopped her own wood, repaired her fences, and raised a small herd of cattle that was just enough to keep her fed and clothed. Her hands were rough, her back strong, and her voice seldom used. She had no one to talk to, just the wind that crept through the cracks in the cabin walls and the coyotes that howled at night. Despite the silence, Clara found a strange comfort in solitude. The land, though harsh, never lied to her. It didn't care about scars. The sun burned everyone equally. The rain didn't ask for beauty before falling. Here, among the rocks and sagebrush, she could exist without shame. But sometimes, when dusk painted the world gold and violet, she caught herself remembering what it felt like to be touched, to be seen, to laugh. Those memories came uninvited, like ghosts brushing the edges of her thoughts, and she'd chase them off with work. Loneliness was safer than longing. One evening, after fixing a broken corral post, Clara paused at the fence line. Her fingers were raw and her breath came in short gasps. She glanced toward the horizon, where a storm brewed far off in the desert. The sky was streaked with crimson, a color that reminded her too much of the night her world burned. Her chest tightened and she turned away quickly, forcing herself to focus on the cattle grazing near the ridge. A low sound caught her ear, a groan carried by the wind. It wasn't the cry of an animal. It was human. She froze, listening. There it was again, faint but real. Someone was out there. Her first instinct was to retreat inside and bolt the door. Strangers meant trouble in this country. Outlaws sometimes drifted through, and Clara had learned long ago that a woman alone couldn't afford kindness. But something in the sound, a note of pain, maybe desperation, pulled at her. She hesitated only a moment before grabbing the lantern and her rifle. The desert grass crunched under her boots as she moved toward the noise. The wind smelled of dust and sage. When she rounded a clump of rocks near the ridge, her lantern light fell upon a figure slumped against the fence. Tall, dark-haired, his shirt soaked with blood. An Apache, she realized at once. His skin was copper-toned, his hair braided and streaked with sweat and dust. A bullet wound darkened his side. For a heartbeat, fear gripped her. The old warnings came back, stories told in town about raids and vengeance. But the man before her wasn't raiding. He was dying. Clara's throat went dry. She could leave him. No one would know. But something deep inside, perhaps the part of her that still remembered what mercy felt like, made her lower the rifle. She knelt beside him, pressed her hand to his wound, and whispered into the silence, "Don't you die here." For the first time in years, her voice trembled not with fear but with something that felt like purpose. She didn't know who he was or why fate had brought him to her land. But the decision was made. Clara Dawson, the woman who'd sworn she'd never let anyone close again, was about to let a wounded Apache into her home, and neither of their lives would ever be the same. Taza had ridden, for 2 days without food, water, or rest. The desert had become a living furnace around him, sand burning beneath his moccasins, wind clawing at his wounds. Every step sent a pulse of pain through his ribs where the bullet lodged deep, and his vision blurred with each heartbeat. Still, he pressed on. Death, he had decided, would have to chase him to earn its prize. He had been hunted before. By soldiers, by bounty men, and even by his own tribe. Once he had been a respected tracker among the Chiricahua Apache, known for moving through the desert without leaving a print. But that was before the raid, before he'd chosen mercy over vengeance. A year ago, Taza had led a group of settlers out of an ambush when the fighting between his people and the white men turned brutal. He had helped women and children escape through a canyon while his own blood brothers fought and died. To the soldiers, he was still the Apache. To his tribe, he was a traitor. Exiled, branded a coward, he carried the shame like a shadow that never left. Now, he wandered the wastelands with no name, no tribe, no home. When the ranchers spotted him near the border of their land, they didn't ask questions. A brown-skinned man with braids and beads was reason enough for a rifle. He had fled into the night, taking one bullet to his side before disappearing into the darkness. By the time he reached the woman's fence line, his strength was gone. He remembered falling, dust rising around him, the stars spinning above. The last thing he saw before the world went black was the flicker of a lantern. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments, light, warmth, pain. He blinked, realizing he was lying on a rough-hewn bed, his chest wrapped in clean bandages. The scent of smoke and bread filled the small room. A woman's voice, quiet but firm, murmured nearby. "You'll live if you don't tear the stitches." Taza turned his head slowly. The woman sat beside the hearth, sewing something with deliberate care. Her hair was loose auburn in the firelight, but what caught his attention were the scars, pale ridges trailing down her cheek and neck like rivers carved by flame. He'd seen the same kind of burns on men who'd survived raids, but never on someone so still, so steady. She noticed his gaze and turned away slightly, her hand going up to cover her face. "You're awake," she said. Her voice carried that practiced tone of someone who'd learned not to invite conversation. Taza's throat was dry. "Where am I?" "On my land," she answered. "About 10 miles west of Holbrook. You were bleeding by my corral. I couldn't just leave you there." He frowned, trying to push himself upright. Pain flared, sharp and punishing. "You should have." She looked up then, her green eyes flashing. "I probably should have," she said, "but I didn't." He studied her for a long moment, trying to read the story behind those scars, behind that steady defiance. He'd met many settlers, most would have left him to die. Yet here she was, risking everything by bringing an Apache into her cabin. "Why help me?" he asked finally. Clara hesitated. "Because no one helped me once," she said softly. And that was all she offered. The next few days blurred into one long stretch of silence. Clara worked from dawn to dusk, feeding the livestock, chopping wood, tending the wound on his side with care that surprised him. She never asked about his past, never pried. When she did speak, it was only to give instructions. "Don't move too much. You'll tear the stitches. There's bread on the table." Taza, for his part, watched. The way she moved told him more than her words ever could. She was used to pain, the slow kind that didn't bleed but weighed on the soul. Her hands were rough but careful, her back straight, her eyes alert, as if she'd built walls around herself and learned to live inside them. One night, when the fire was low, she caught him watching her. "You should rest," she murmured, not looking at him. "I have rested too long," he replied. His voice was deep, calm, carrying an old weariness. When she shifted uncomfortably, turning her face away, he added quietly, "Don't look away." The word startled her. For a second she froze. His tone wasn't commanding, just honest. She met his gaze then, and something unspoken passed between them. In his eyes she saw no pity, no revulsion, only understanding, like he was seeing beyond her skin, straight into the part of her that still burned. For Taza, it was the first time in years he'd felt the weight of someone else's pain that matched his own. The woman with the fire-scarred face, the man with the exile-scarred soul. Two survivors who didn't yet know they'd been found. The morning after Taza woke, the desert dawn stretched slow and golden across Clara's land. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dust and sage. Inside the cabin, Taza sat propped on a cot near the hearth, his face drawn and pale but his eyes sharp as ever. Clara watched him from the table, torn between wariness and something she didn't want to name. He shouldn't still be here, she told herself. An Apache in her home was a danger she couldn't afford, not with the ranchers always looking for excuses to claim her land. Yet every time she looked at him, the memory of that night returned, his blood pooling in the dirt, his breath shallow as a child's. She couldn't turn him out to die. Not after she'd dragged him from the fence line and stitched his wound with trembling hands. Now, as he sat watching her grind coffee beans, she felt the weight of his gaze. Not invasive, just present. He didn't stare at her scars. He looked at her eyes when he spoke, which unsettled her more than if he'd looked away. "You work too much," he said quietly. His English carried the steady rhythm of someone who'd learned it later in life, each word deliberate. She didn't glance up. "Somebody has to. I can help. You can barely stand," she shot back. "You'll tear the stitches if you move wrong." He smiled faintly, the first she'd seen. "Then I'll move right." Something about his calm made her grip the table harder. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "I did what anyone would have done." He tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes narrowing. "No," he said. "Not anyone." Her chest tightened. He was right. No one else would have helped him. And maybe, she thought, no one else would have helped her either if their positions were reversed. The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Later that day, she stepped outside to check the corral. The sun was already high, baking the earth. She heard movement behind her and turned to find Taza at the door, steadying himself against the frame. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded. "Walking," he replied simply. "You said the cattle need watching." Her instinct was to order him back inside, but she stopped when she saw the way he squared his shoulders despite the pain. Pride, she realized. He had the same stubbornness she'd lived by for years, the refusal to be pitied, to be seen as weak. She sighed and handed him her old hat. "Fine. But if you fall, I'm not carrying you again." A glimmer of humor touched his lips. "Then I won't fall." Together they walked the fence line. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt like the desert itself, wide and alive, filled with meanings that didn't need words. Every now and then, she caught him scanning the land, his eyes moving with practiced precision. He noticed things she never had. A coyote trail through the brush, a broken hoof print near the stream, a hawk's nest in the rocks above. "You see more than most," she said finally. He shrugged lightly. "The desert speaks if you listen." She nodded. "Maybe I forgot how." He looked at her then, and for a heartbeat the world narrowed to the space between them. "You haven't forgotten," he said. "You've just been alone too long." Clara turned away, her breath unsteady. She wasn't used to anyone seeing her so clearly, not since before the fire. The burn scars on her face had become her shield. They kept people from looking too close, yet Taza didn't seem to see them at all. That frightened her more than the fire ever had. That night she couldn't sleep. She heard him shift in his cot by the hearth, muttering softly in Apache. The words low and rhythmic, like a prayer or a memory. The sound eased her in a strange way, though she couldn't understand it. When she stirred the coals to keep the fire alive, his voice broke through the shadows. "You don't have to be afraid." "I'm not," she said too quickly. "Yes, you are," he replied, not unkindly. "You look at me like I might take something from you." She swallowed. "I've had enough taken." He was silent for a moment. Then softly, "So have I." Their eyes met across the dim firelight, hers green and guarded, his dark and steady. It was the first time she realized that maybe they weren't so different. Two souls carved by loss, meeting in a place where neither had meant to be found. Before dawn, Clara heard the distant rumble of hooves, ranchers heading toward her land. Her heart sank. If they found an Apache here, they wouldn't ask questions. They'd shoot first and claim righteousness later. She looked toward the sleeping man by the hearth, his breathing steady now, his face calm. He had trusted her enough to rest here under her roof. Clara stood by the window, gripping her rifle. She'd saved him once. Now she might have to do it again. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, quiet, careful, and strange. Taza's wound began to knit under Clara's steady hand, though he refused to rest as much as he should. Each morning she would find him outside, sitting near the corral, his eyes scanning the horizon as if reading something in the sand that she couldn't see. He was a man of stillness, and that stillness unsettled her more than any word might have. Clara had grown used to the kind of men who filled silence with noise. Drunk cowhands, loud traders or ranchers who talked to hear their own courage echo. Taza was none of that. He didn't need to prove himself. He simply was, quiet, patient, and deliberate in every movement. And that quiet began to shift the air around her home. The first morning he offered to help mend the fence, she almost refused. "You shouldn't," she said, watching him stand, his hand pressed against his bandaged ribs. "You're still healing." He only nodded toward the broken posts. "So is the fence," he said. Clara didn't answer, but she handed him a hammer. Together they worked through the heat, wordless except for the rhythm of wood and metal. She drove nails while he held the board steady, his strength returning by the hour. When she wiped the sweat from her brow, she caught him glancing at her, not in pity but as if memorizing her movements. It made her heart stutter in her chest. By noon, the fence stood straight again. Clara leaned against a post, catching her breath. "You work like someone who's never known rest," he said. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Rest doesn't build fences," she replied. Taza smiled faintly. "No, but it builds hearts." She frowned at that, not sure what to do with the warmth his words left behind. "I'm not fixing my heart," she muttered. "Just my land." "Land can't hold you when you sleep," he said softly. "Hearts can." The words hung between them, raw and quiet, like a secret neither dared to claim. That evening, after supper, the desert wind howled against the cabin walls. Clara sat by the fire, mending a torn shirt. It was his, the same one she'd cut open to treat his wound. The fabric was rough, frayed at the edges, but she worked carefully, her needle flashing in the firelight. Taza watched her from across the room, seated on a stool, sharpening his knife against a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape blended with the crackle of the fire. "You don't talk much," she said after a while, surprising herself. He didn't look up. "Words are like arrows," he said. "If you use too many, you miss your mark." She almost smiled. "Then I suppose I've been missing mine for years." He glanced up, meeting her eyes. "You hit more than you think." She looked away, her hands trembling slightly around the needle. It had been years since anyone spoke to her without pity, without condescension. The burn scars on her face had made people treat her like glass, fragile, breakable, something to look past. But Taza's gaze never flinched. When his eyes lingered, they seemed to say, "I see you." And for the first time since the fire, Clara didn't feel invisible. Days turned into weeks. His wound closed and he began walking farther into the hills, bringing back rabbits or firewood without being asked. Sometimes he'd leave a feather or a small carved stone by the window, tokens from the land, though he never explained their meaning. She kept them anyway, setting them on the shelf like quiet promises. In the evenings, they shared small things. He taught her to read the ground, the way a bent stalk of grass could reveal which way a deer had passed, how the dust could tell if a storm was coming. She, in turn, taught him how to make bread rise without burning, how to patch leather, how to hum a tune without words. Their silences grew full, not empty. It was as though the desert itself listened when they didn't speak. One night, the stars came out sharp and endless above the desert. Clara stepped outside to breathe the cool air. Taza stood near the fence, looking toward the horizon. "The moon is bright tonight," she said. He nodded. "My people say the moon carries the faces of those we've lost. When it's full, they're watching." She looked up, eyes tracing the pale glow across the sky. "Then I hope mine are proud," she whispered. "They are," he said without hesitation. "They gave you fire, and you lived through it." Clara turned to him, her throat tightening. "Fire didn't give me anything. It took everything." He looked at her, his voice low. "No, it left you what others can't see, strength. Scars don't take beauty. They reveal it." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of sage and rain. Something inside her cracked, the smallest fissure in a heart that had been sealed for too long. That night, when she lay awake, she realized something had changed. The silence that had once been her prison had become their language. And in that silence, healing had begun, slow, fragile, and real. Taza had not only mended her fence, he was mending her spirit. By early summer, Clara's ranch began to feel different, alive in a way it hadn't in years. The fences stood straight, the cattle were strong, and the garden she thought too barren to bother with now bloomed with beans and corn, thanks to Taza's careful irrigation. The desert no longer felt like an enemy pressing against her walls. It felt almost like home again. Each day began with work and ended in quiet comfort. She had even caught herself humming as she kneaded bread or filled the water troughs. It scared her, that feeling. Peace had never stayed long in her life. And somewhere deep down, she knew it wouldn't this time either. The first sign came in dust. 4 riders approaching from the south, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky. Clara froze as she spotted them from the porch. They were men she recognized from town. Frank Mallory, a cattleman with a cruel smirk, and his usual companions, men who believed a widow's land was theirs for the taking. Her heart began to pound. They'd stayed away since her husband's death, content to spread gossip and wait for her to fail. But now they rode straight toward her property, and she knew why. The rumors. Someone must have told them an Apache was living on her land. Taza appeared from behind the barn, his hand automatically brushing the knife on his belt. He followed her gaze and stiffened. "You know them?" "Yes," Clara said quietly. "And I know what they want." The riders stopped near the corral. Mallory tipped his hat, his grin wide and venomous. "Afternoon, Miss Dawson," he drawled. "Heard you had company. Thought we'd pay our respects." "Respect," she said, crossing her arms, "isn't something you've ever brought to my land." Mallory laughed, glancing toward Taza. "Well, now I see you've got yourself a new hand. Not sure the sheriff would call that proper. Harboring one of his kind might cause you trouble." Taza didn't move, but his stance changed, a quiet readiness. Like the desert before lightning strikes, Clara's voice was steady, though her heart hammered. "He works for me. That's all you need to know." Mallory's eyes glinted. "Is that right? 'Cause rumor has it he's more than just help. You letting savages sleep under your roof now?" The words burned like acid. Before she could speak, Taza stepped forward, his gaze fixed and cold. "You should leave," he said evenly. Mallory chuckled. "I don't take orders from redskins." Taza didn't flinch. "Then take them from the woman who owns this land." The men shifted uneasily, hands near their gun belts. Clara's pulse jumped. "That's enough," she said sharply, stepping between them. "You're trespassing. Leave now or I'll ride to the sheriff myself." Mallory's smirk twisted. "You go on and do that. But folks might start asking questions, Miss Dawson, like why you're hiding an outlaw on your property." He spat into the dirt, then turned his horse. "We'll be seeing you soon," he called over his shoulder. "And maybe next time we won't come to talk." When the sound of hooves faded, the silence felt heavier than any storm. Clara's hands trembled as she gripped the porch railing. Taza stood beside her, calm as ever, though a muscle worked in his jaw. "They'll be back," she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Men like that always come back." She swallowed hard. They could tell the sheriff. "He doesn't need much reason to drag you in." "I can leave," Taza said quietly. "It will keep you safe." She turned to him sharply. "No, you're not running from them." "Not again." His eyes met hers, dark, steady, unflinching. "You don't understand. When I fight, they will say it's my fault. They will come for you next." "Let them," she snapped, surprising herself with the fire in her tone. "I've lived through worse than their talk." He hesitated. "You should not risk your life for mine." "I'm not," she said, voice shaking. "I'm standing up for my own." That night, the unease hung thick in the cabin. Clara sat by the window, her rifle across her lap while Taza checked the perimeter in silence. The moonlight painted his profile silver through the glass, strong, calm, and impossibly still. She wanted to tell him how his presence had changed everything, how the ranch had begun to feel alive again, how she'd started to feel alive again. But fear kept the words locked in her throat. She wasn't ready to lose the fragile peace they'd built. Not yet. When he returned, he stood beside her at the window. "You should sleep," he murmured. "I can't." He studied her face for a long moment. Then softly he said, "You are not alone anymore, Clara." Something inside her broke open at that. For 6 years she'd carried the weight of survival alone, her pain, her scars, her silence. And now, in this quiet cabin under the threat of men who wanted to destroy her, she realized something simple but fierce. She would rather face them all than go back to being invisible. She turned to him, her voice steady. "Then neither are you." They stood there in the dim glow of the hearth, two outcasts bound not by pity, but by the strength born from their wounds. Outside, the desert wind rose, a warning, a promise. The shadows had returned to her land. But this time, Clara Dawson would not face them alone. The wind moaned across the desert that night, tugging at the cabin walls like some restless spirit. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken fear. Clara had bolted the doors and drawn the curtains. Though she knew flimsy wood wouldn't stop bullets or hatred, still she couldn't sleep. Every sound outside, the cry of a coyote, the groan of an old beam, made her heart jolt. Taza sat by the fire sharpening his knife, his movement steady, calm, deliberate. The faint scrape of metal filled the silence like a heartbeat. He hadn't said much since the rancher's visit, but his presence was solid as the stones in the hearth. He seemed unafraid, yet Clara could feel the tension humming beneath his stillness. "Do you ever rest?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the quiet. He didn't look up. "Not when danger walks near. You think they'll come back tonight?" His dark eyes flicked toward her. "Men like Mallory?" He paused, the corner of his mouth tightening. "They talk loud before they strike. They'll wait for daylight. They want you scared before they ride in." She swallowed hard. "Then they're getting what they want." He looked at her then, really looked, his gaze steady, deep, and unguarded. "They don't deserve your fear," he said softly. "Fear is something you give only to those who've earned it." Clara let out a brittle laugh. "Easy for you to say. You've probably stared down more rifles than I've seen in my life." He shook his head. "No one grows used to guns pointed at their heart." For a moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across her face. She turned away, self-conscious. The firelight made the scars along her cheek gleam like molten silver. "Don't," he said quietly. She blinked. "Don't what?" "Don't turn away." His voice was soft but firm, like a hand resting against her chin. "You hide when you think someone's looking too long." "You shouldn't," her breath caught. "You don't understand." "I do," he interrupted gently. "I know what it means to be looked at like you're less than what you are. To feel people's eyes weigh you like a crime. You think my skin or my name has ever been welcome in their towns?" Clara said nothing. He continued, his tone low, steady. "When I was exiled from my people, I thought I'd lost everything. But there's worse than losing a home. Worse is believing you don't deserve one." Something inside her gave way at those words. She sat down across from him, the fire between them, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The night of the fire," she whispered. "I tried to run back into the flames. My husband was still inside. They pulled me out, but he was gone." She drew in a shaky breath. "After that, I didn't want to be seen. I didn't want to be pitied. So I stayed out here where no one could look at me and remember what they'd lost." Taza's eyes didn't leave hers. "You didn't hide because of the fire. You hid because the world doesn't know how to look at strength." Her throat tightened. "Strength?" she said bitterly. "You call this strength?" She touched the scar that traced from her temple to her neck. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fire took your skin, not your beauty." Her breath shuddered. No one had ever said that to her. No one had even dared to suggest it. He said it without hesitation, without pity. The words struck deep, shaking loose all the pain she had buried beneath layers of silence. Her eyes filled, and before she could turn away, he reached out and touched her cheek. His hand was rough, calloused, yet gentle as a whisper. She didn't flinch. The warmth of his palm steadied her breathing, anchored her to something real. "You are not broken," he said. "You are proof that fire cannot kill everything it touches." Tears slipped down her scarred cheek, and she didn't wipe them away. For the first time since the night of the fire, she let someone see her. They sat like that. Two people bound by pain and something deeper, unspoken. The flames between them softened to embers, painting the room in amber light. Outside, the wind had stilled, as if the desert itself paused to listen. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper. "What will you do when they come back?" He lowered his hand slowly. "Whatever I must." She hesitated. "You could leave, Taza, save yourself." He shook his head. "A man runs when he has nothing worth standing for." "I have found something worth standing for." Her breath hitched. "What?" His gaze held hers, unwavering. "You." For a long time she couldn't speak. The words sank deep into the cracks of her heart like water finding its way through stone. The fire popped, the scent of smoke curling through the air, and in that fragile moment she understood that love didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in quietly, through the cracks left by loss. She looked at... Morning came pale and sharp, the kind that turned the desert into a sea of light and shadow. Clara hadn't slept. She'd spent most of the night listening, to the soft rasp of Taza's breath, to the creak of the cabin timbers, to her own heart beating with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. But when the sun climbed higher, reality returned. Hope was fragile, and men like Mallory knew how to crush it. From the cabin porch she could see dust rising from the south, the rancher's trail. They were coming back just as Taza said they would. They ride with more men this time, Taza murmured, scanning the horizon. His voice was calm, but his jaw tightened. 6, maybe 7, Clara's stomach twisted. You can't fight that many. I don't plan to fight, he said. Not unless I must. But she saw the truth in his eyes. He was ready. A warrior never lost that instinct. It was in his bones. He moved around the cabin, checking the rifle, tightening the saddle straps on his horse, and spreading sand over the floorboards to muffle footsteps. She watched him in silence, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. I won't let them hurt you, he said quietly. Taza, please, she whispered. They'll kill you. He turned to her. If I die standing. Not hiding. She wanted to argue, to scream at him, to run, but the look in his eyes stopped her. There was no fear there. Only resolve. By noon, the sound of hooves thundered closer. Clara's pulse drummed in her ears. She peeked through the curtain and saw them. 7 riders, all in dust-covered hats, their rifles gleaming in the sun. Mallory led them, his sneer already in place. Taza stepped onto the porch, unarmed, hands open. You don't belong here, Mallory, he called out, his voice strong enough to carry over the wind. You've no right to cross this line. Mallory laughed. The hell I don't. This land ain't Apache land. It ain't scar-faced widow land either. You think you can play house out here, Redskin? Clara flinched, fury rising in her chest. But Taza didn't move. His voice was even. Leave now, and no one gets hurt. The men on their horses exchanged glances, uneasy, uncertain. But Mallory's pride burned hotter than his sense. You threatening me? I'm warning you. The pause stretched long. Then Mallory spit into the dirt and nodded to his men. Burn it. 2 riders dismounted, grabbing torches from their saddlebags. Clara's breath hitched. Flames again. Taza moved like lightning. He slammed his boot into the first man's chest, sending him sprawling. Before the second could react, Taza snatched the torch and swung, scattering embers harmlessly into the sand. Chaos broke loose. Horses reared, men shouted. A rifle went off, the bullet splintering wood near the cabin door. Clara ducked, heart pounding. Taza dove for cover behind a trough, firing back once, the shot echoing across the canyon. 1 rider's hat flew off, and the man bolted behind his horse. Enough! Clara screamed, stepping out with the shotgun she kept for coyotes. Get off my land. Her voice cracked the air like a whip. For a heartbeat, even Mallory froze. Taza stood then, dust on his skin, blood trickling down his temple where a splinter had caught him. He looked every inch the warrior she'd imagined in her dreams. Fierce, unbroken. Mallory saw it too, and fear flickered across his face. He didn't expect a fight, not from an Apache, and certainly not from the scarred woman he used to pity. This ain't over, Mallory spat finally. We'll be back. You won't find us here, Taza said, lowering his rifle. Next time you come, you'll find your courage buried in the sand. Mallory scowled, yanked his reins, and turned his horse. The others followed, grumbling but obedient. Dust swallowed them as they rode off, leaving silence in their wake. Clara stood trembling, the shotgun still in her hands. The smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. When it was finally quiet, she looked at Taza. You're bleeding. He wiped his brow and smiled faintly. I've had worse. She moved closer, pressing a cloth to his temple, her hands shaking. You could have been killed. He caught her wrist gently. You too. Their eyes met, and the weight of everything they just survived hung between them. Fear, fire, blood, and something fierce and alive. She swallowed hard. What now? He glanced toward the horizon, where the riders had vanished into the glare. They'll be back, maybe not today, but soon. We can't stay here, her chest tightened. Then where? He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, North. Into the mountains. There's a canyon where no white men go. It's safe, she hesitated. You mean run? I mean live, he said. Together. The word together landed like a promise. For a moment, neither moved. Then she nodded, slowly but surely. All right, she whispered. Let's live. Taza smiled, small, proud, almost tender. We leave at dawn. Outside, the desert wind picked up again, sweeping away the ashes of battle. Inside, Clara packed her few belongings with trembling hands, knowing she was leaving behind the ghosts of her past, and following a man who had taught her the hardest truth of all, that love was not about beauty or safety. It was about standing, side by side when the world wanted you to hide. Dawn broke cold and pink over the desert, painting the horizon in soft bands of fire and rose. Clara stood by the cabin for a long time, watching the light stretch across the sand. It touched everything: the dead mesquite trees, the horse trough, even the splintered wood where bullets had struck. It was a new day, but nothing felt safe. The air still carried the bitter scent of gunpowder and smoke. Behind her, Taza finished packing the last of their supplies: dried meat, canteens, a few blankets, and the rifle. His movements were efficient, silent. He was a man who'd lived on the edge of danger too long to waste time with words. Clara turned and glanced at him. "You really think we can make it through the mountains?" He nodded once. "There's a trail most men don't know. It winds through canyons and dry riverbeds. My father showed it to me when I was young. We can reach safety before they find our tracks." She tightened her shawl, feeling the morning chill bite her skin, and after that, he met her gaze. "We start again." Those words, "we start again," settled in her heart like a quiet flame. For years, her life had been nothing but survival. Now, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine living. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, they were on horseback riding north. Taza led, scanning the land with sharp eyes. The desert stretched endless before them. Rolling dunes, dry creek beds, the skeletons of saguaro trees. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was comfortable. The rhythm of the horse's hooves, the wind whistling through the rocks. It all became part of something bigger, something steady. As they rode deeper into the wild, Clara couldn't help but look back. The cabin was already a small speck behind them, swallowed by the desert. That lonely shack had once been her prison. Now it was her past. By midday, they reached the foothills, red cliffs rising like sentinels from the earth. The land grew rougher, the air cooler. Taza dismounted and led the horses on foot through a narrow ravine. The ground was scattered with stones and the wind howled between the canyon walls. "We'll rest here," he said finally, stopping beneath a natural arch of rock. "No one will find us before nightfall." Clara slid off her horse, her legs trembling. "You sound certain," he smiled faintly. "I know this land better than any map." She sat on a flat rock, rubbing her sore hands. "You've lived out here a long time, haven't you?" He nodded. "Since I was cast out. My people said I brought misfortune after I disobeyed the elders. But the desert became my teacher. It gives nothing freely, but everything it offers it means." Clara looked around. The vastness, the silence, the endless stretch of sky. "And you survived here alone?" "I thought I did," he said quietly. "Until I met you," her breath caught. She turned her face toward the canyon wall to hide her reaction, but he saw the faint tremor in her shoulders. "You don't have to be alone anymore, Clara." She swallowed. "It's all I've known since the fire." He knelt beside her, his shadow falling across the stone. "Fire didn't take you. It left you strong enough to walk through it. That strength brought you here." His words sank deep. She looked at him. Really looked. The lines at the corners of his eyes, the sun-browned skin, the quiet intensity that lived in him. This was not the life she had once dreamed of, but it was real, and real felt like salvation. They rested through the heat of the afternoon, sharing water and silence. At dusk, the world turned gold. A hawk cried high above, circling against the dying light. Taza built a small fire hidden behind rocks, its glow faint and safe. They ate in quiet companionship. For the first time, Clara felt no fear of the flames. She stared into them, mesmerized, remembering how once fire had been her undoing. Now it was warmth, a living thing that did not judge. "Tomorrow," Taza said, "we'll climb higher. There's a stream in the canyon and caves where we can rest." She nodded, but her eyes remained on the fire. "It's strange," she murmured. "All this time I thought I'd never feel safe again. And yet here with you." He looked at her gently. "Safety isn't a place, Clara. It's a person." The silence after those words was heavier than any sound. She turned toward him, eyes glistening in the firelight. "Why me?" she whispered. "You could have chosen anyone else to help, anyone else to love." He studied her face. The scars, the sorrow, the stubborn light that refused to die. Because you looked at me the way no one else ever has. Not as an exile. Not as an Apache. Just as a man. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling silently. She didn't look away this time. The firelight danced between them, painting the stone walls in gold and shadow. Outside, the stars began to pierce the twilight one by one. Taza reached for her hand, his fingers rough and warm. She didn't pull back. Under the vast western sky, surrounded by silence and danger and beauty, two souls who had lost everything began to find something the world had tried to take from them: trust. When the night grew colder, she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder. For the first time in years, Clara slept without fear. And as she dreamed, Taza kept watch, his eyes scanning the darkness. Somewhere beyond the cliffs, danger still moved, but so did hope. He looked down at the woman beside him, her scars glowing faintly in the firelight, and whispered into the wind, "We will not run forever. One day we'll belong." The stars seemed to listen. The mountains, ancient and still, stood guard over them both. By the third day in the mountains, the land had changed entirely. The wide-open desert gave way to stone canyons, whispering pines, and the steady rush of a hidden stream. The air was cooler here, cleaner. To Clara, it smelled like freedom, but beneath that calm ran tension like an undercurrent, both between them and from the world beyond the ridges. Mallory wouldn't forget the humiliation of being driven off. She knew vengeance was only a matter of time. Taza seemed to sense it too. He was quiet as they built a small camp near the canyon stream, his eyes often scanning the horizon. Still, when Clara caught him looking at her, there was warmth there, not fear. That night, the wind turned sharp. They built a small fire sheltered by stone. Clara sat close to it, rubbing her hands together. "Feels strange," she murmured. "All those years I couldn't even look at fire. Now I can't imagine a night without it." Taza added a stick to the flames. "Fire destroys what it touches," he said softly. "But it also gives light. You can't hate it forever." She smiled faintly. "You sound like a preacher." He shook his head. "No, just a man who's lost and found too many things." A comfortable silence settled. The flames flickered across the canyon walls, painting their shadows side by side, hers delicate and slender, his broad and still. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Clara said quietly, "Do you ever think about going back to your people?" Taza's eyes lingered on the fire. "They would not have me. I broke a vow." "What vow?" He hesitated, the firelight reflecting in his dark eyes. "My father was a war chief. I was meant to follow him, but I refused to fight against settlers who had done no harm. The elders called it weakness. I called it mercy. So they cast me out." Clara listened, her heart tightening. "And you've lived alone ever since?" He nodded. "Until you." She turned toward him, her eyes glistening. "You keep saying that like I saved you." He looked at her then, the flames reflecting off his cheekbones. "You did. You saw me when no one else would." Her lips trembled. "And you saw me," she whispered, "when I didn't want to be seen at all." The fire cracked between them. She could feel his gaze, steady, sure, patient. Slowly, she reached up, touching the scar that cut across her cheek. "All my life," she said, "this has been my shame. But when you look at me, I forget it's even there." He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of her scar. "That's because it isn't a mark of shame," he said quietly. "It's a mark of survival." Her breath caught. The world seemed to narrow to just the sound of the fire in his voice. "I used to think," she said, her tone trembling, "that love was something that happened to beautiful people. That it wasn't meant for someone like me." Taza shook his head. "Love isn't about beauty. It's about truth. And you are the truest thing I've ever known." Something in her broke then, not in pain, but in release. The weight she had carried for years lifted like smoke into the stars. "Taza," she began, but her voice faltered. He took her hand, strong and calloused, holding it between his palms. "You don't need to speak. Just listen." He looked into the fire and then back at her. "Among my people, when two souls are bound, they make a vow before the flame. The fire becomes a witness, it burns away lies and fear." Her eyes widened. "A vow?" He nodded. "I vow to walk beside you through whatever the world brings. To protect you, even if it costs my life." Tears welled in her eyes. "Taza," he smiled faintly. "Now you speak your vow." She hesitated, trembling. Then she drew a deep breath and said, "I vow to stop hiding, from the world, from the pain, from myself. I'll walk beside you even when it's hard." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Taza took a small coal from the fire with a stick, pressing it gently into the dirt between them. The glow shimmered like a living heart. "Then it is done," he whispered. For a long time, neither moved. Then Clara leaned forward, her voice barely above the wind. "Does this mean I'm your wife now?" He looked at her with something between reverence and tenderness. In the eyes of the fire, yes. The flames danced higher for a moment, as if answering the vow. Clara's heart swelled, fear and peace twisting together until she couldn't tell one from the other. She reached up, touching his cheek. "I never thought I'd have this again." "You were never meant to be alone," he said simply. Outside, the wind died down. The night turned still, the stars crowding the sky like silent witnesses. Clara leaned her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since the fire that had changed her life, she felt whole. They sat like that until the flames dimmed to embers, and though no church bell rang, no preacher spoke, a promise was made in the heart of the wild, two wounded souls finding belonging in each other. But as the last ember flickered out, far below in the valley a faint light moved among the dark lanterns. Riders. Mallory had found their trail. The first light of dawn spilled over the canyon, pale gold and cold as steel. The mountain air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and river. Clara woke to the sound of movement, soft but urgent. Taza was already awake, crouched near the ridge with his rifle in hand. His eyes were fixed on the valley below. When she came to his side, he didn't speak right away. He just pointed. Down among the rocks and scrub, small lantern lights flickered like fireflies. Riders. Mallory had come. "How many?" She whispered. "5, he said. "Enough to mean trouble." Her throat went dry. "We can run." He shook his head. "They'd see our tracks. There's no cover till the ridge ends. If we move now, they'll corner us." Clara stared at him, her heart hammering. "Then what do we do?" He looked at her, calm and steady, as if he had already made peace with what must come. "We stand." She felt the words sink deep into her chest. "Stand. Not run, not hide. Stand." He loaded the rifle, checked his knife, then turned to her. "If anything happens, if I fall, you take the horses and ride north. There's a trading post 2 days away. You'll be safe there." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice trembling. He gave a faint smile. "I knew you'd say that." The sun climbed higher, burning the mist away. From the canyon's edge, they could see the riders clearly now. Mallory in front, his face twisted with rage, his coat flapping behind him like a dark flag. Taza moved with quiet precision, positioning himself behind a boulder. Clara crouched beside him, clutching the shotgun. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her eyes were steady. As the first rider reached the base of the hill, Taza fired. The shot cracked across the canyon, scattering the horses. One man tumbled into the dust. Mallory cursed and signaled his men to spread out. Gunfire erupted. Bullets chipped stone near Clara's face, sending shards flying. She flinched but held her ground. "Taza!" she shouted, reloading. "I'm here!" He called back, his voice like thunder against the cliffs. For several minutes the air was nothing but sound. Gunfire, echoes, the terrified cries of horses. Smoke curled between the rocks, stinging Clara's eyes. Then silence. She peered over the edge. 2 riders were down. 3 remained, creeping closer. Mallory's voice rang out, cold and cruel. "You think you can hide forever, Apache? You and that scar-faced woman? You're done." Clara's blood boiled. Before Taza could stop her, she stood and shouted back, "You call me scarred like it's an insult, but at least I earned mine." Mallory laughed. "Then you'll die with them, sweetheart." His rifle lifted, aiming straight for her. Taza moved before she could blink. He shoved her aside and fired. Mallory's gun went off at the same time. The echoes clashed like thunder. When the smoke cleared, Mallory was down, his hat rolling into the dust. But Taza staggered, the rifle slipping from his hands. "Taza!" Clara cried, catching him as he fell. Blood stained his shirt dark and spreading. He gritted his teeth, trying to stay upright. "Just a graze," he said, though she could see it was more than that. The last of Mallory's men hesitated, then turned their horses and fled. The canyon swallowed them, leaving only silence. Clara pressed her hand to his wound, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with me. Please stay with me." His eyes found hers, steady even through the pain. "You kept your vow," he whispered. "You didn't look away." Her heart broke and mended in the same breath. Neither did you, he smiled weakly. Then we've both won. She tore a strip from her shawl and pressed it to his wound, desperate. You're not dying. Do you hear me? Not after everything. He reached up, his hand trembling, and touched her cheek. If I fall. Remember what I said. Fire doesn't destroy, it reveals what survives. Tears burned her eyes. You survived, Taza, you hear me? You will. The wind rose through the canyon, carrying the faint scent of smoke and pine. Above them, the sun broke through the clouds, spilling light over the two of them, raw, bright, alive. And in that golden light, Taza opened his eyes again. He wasn't gone. Not yet, she laughed through her tears, pressing his hand to her heart. We start again, she whispered, the same words he'd spoken days before. He managed a faint smile. Together. By midday, the danger had passed. Clara tended his wound, bound it tight, and helped him sit near the stream. The water glimmered like glass. They sat in silence, watching the light dance on the surface. The world felt new again, stripped of everything but truth. You saved me, she said softly. He shook his head. No. You saved us. The canyon wind carried their laughter, their quiet words up toward the endless blue. Below, the ashes of their fight settled into the dust, already fading back into the land. And there, in the heart of the wild, where no one could take their freedom or their love, Clara and Taza began the next chapter of their story. Not as the scarred woman and the outcast warrior, but as two souls who had chosen not to look away from each other, no matter how fierce the fire burned.